If you're going to do a video on the relationship between Islam and slavery, you can expect two things. The first one is you can expect some bias. There's going to be bias in the traditional sort of Islamic literature. There's going to be bias in the da'wah videos. There's also going to be bias in like sort of more academic-y type literature from universities.
And two, there will be hate mail. It might be from Muslims, atheists, pastafarians. That's an actual thing. Someone somewhere will not be very happy by what you have to say. So why are we doing this?
We think it's an important topic that gets quite heavily politicized. And we haven't really seen any good videos on this topic. Videos that cut across both theology and academia and really kind of get down to the fact. Our aim isn't to give you all the answers. What we can hope for is to raise some questions and give you some information and really just be nerds about it.
I'm Nourhan, this is Imtiaz Shams, and today we're talking about Islam and slavery.
Now, some critics of Islam are all too keen on painting an ahistorically nasty picture of slavery in Islam. And on the other hand, many Muslims just straight out deny any link between the two.
Modern-day Muslim apologists often argue that Islam was pioneering in the area of abolitionism. And while Islam never explicitly banned slavery, they say Islam created multiple ways of freeing slaves and tackled the root causes of slavery, such as racism and inequality, in order to slowly and eventually end all forms of slavery.
But was that really the case?
We think a good place to start is to see what the main Islamic sources, such as the Quran, the Tafsir, the Hadith, the Seerah, and to some extent Islamic law have to say on the subject.
Overall, there are about 30 references to slavery in the Quran, and several of these are references to freeing slaves. In one of the verses, freeing slaves is mentioned independently as a trait of good, righteous people. And then in some others, it's actually either a way for slave masters to atone for sins, or it's something you can actually put zakat money towards.
However, the Quran mostly deals with slavery much more casually, and while treating your slaves well is emphasized, so for example there are references to the importance of being kind, providing for your slaves, in a specific order not to compel slave girls into prostitution, slavery is generally treated as a normal part of society. Most of the references to slavery are actually about مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ, also known as whom your right hand possesses, or concubines, or sex slaves. And this is where it can get pretty uncomfortable for some people. The term itself is mentioned 15 times in the Quran.
But Nourhan, مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ was surely just a semantic term in that they didn't just do the niqab. Other than that, the concubine had pretty much the same rights as a wife.
To say this is to forget what enslavement actually means. We're going to bring out two concepts that we'll keep coming back to throughout the videos, and these are displacement and dependency.
Displacement is an issue we talk about a lot in the colonial slave trade, the transatlantic one. Human beings were picked up from Africa, trekked across the world, and then plonked into a country that's completely alien to them. It's a completely alien land with no contact to their family, culture, heritage, or anything like that. Dependency, on the other hand, is about autonomy. So if a slave was given status, extra rights, or power, it was done through delegation. And this status can be taken away from their master at any time.
Because of their state of dependency, slaves could be easily exploited and had to follow their master's wishes. They also became particularly vulnerable if at any point they became indispensable to their masters. So when we're talking about a concubine, we're talking about a woman normally uprooted and displaced from her family through war, who is literally owned by another human being until she either dies or is freed, and who could be bought and sold on the whim of her masters.
Many of the verses about مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ are simply dedicated to informing men that slave girls are lawful to them, and explaining how believing men should guard their private parts except with their wives and their concubines.
The concept also comes up in the Hadith and the biography of the Prophet, and from the Quranic verses dealing with the topic, several seem to be addressed specifically to Muhammad. And here's where the tafsir becomes significant. The beginning of Surah Tahrim, for example, addresses Muhammad and talks about him prohibiting what Allah made halal for him while seeking to please his wives. The common interpretation says that this is a reference to a situation where Muhammad's wife Hafsa finds him in her house with Maria, the Coptic slave girl, and becomes very jealous.
There's an alternate tafsir stating that it's actually about honey, and his wife just didn't like the smell of it. But the first tafsir about Maria al-Qibtiyya is generally more accepted. And anyways, putting this verse aside, it's well known that Maria al-Qibtiyya was a gift to Muhammad as a gift from Muqawqis, the Christian king of Egypt. Yeah. It's worth noting here that the opposite concept of a woman sleeping with her male slave is not allowed. So a woman could not have a a male concubine, but she was allowed to marry a male slave.
We have to say that some of the guidelines that the Quran lays out can be quite positive, especially given the time. So, for example, slave owners are encouraged to write contracts with their slaves if the slave is righteous. And you might ask, so what, slavery still wasn't banned? It's important to point out because the Quran at least emphasizes the idea that slaves are human beings and not pure property.
This is something we see in earlier Roman law, and it's actually an important distinction between these older ancient laws and the later, often more brutal transatlantic slave trade. But we've got more of that in our next video, which compares Islamic slavery to other ancient civilizations.
With the Quran, it's very important to look at the historical context. The Quran is split between the Meccan chapters and the Medinan chapters. The Meccan ones are the ones which came earlier when Muhammad was still in Mecca and in a very weak political position. The Medinan chapters were revealed after the Hijrah when Muhammad began building a political institution and essentially a small empire.
If you read the Quran sort of chronologically, you might notice something a bit weird. Most references to freeing slaves appear in the earlier surahs when Islam was just starting out in Mecca, while the later surahs, the ones in Medina, are much more accepting and accommodating of the concept of slavery.
Here again, the history really matters because many of these later verses are very specific to the context of war. But the bottom line here is that the Quran never directly condemns, let alone bans, the institution of slavery or concubinage at any point. There may be references to freeing slaves, but the rights will always be extremely limited as they are dependents and literally owned by other human beings.
To truly explore the theological backdrop of slavery in Islam, we next have to look at the Hadith and the Sunnah of the Prophet. It's important to note that there's disagreement even amongst very traditional Muslims and ulama when it comes to the Sunnah.
Unlike the Quran, the Hadith have various levels of authenticity, so we're going to stick to the ones which are generally viewed as being authentic or sahih. Many Hadith from the earlier days of Islam talk about freeing slaves, and Abu Bakr freed many slaves, including Bilal, who was one of the first people to accept Islam, and famously one of the first man to do the adhan or the summon to prayer.
I saw this YouTube movie trailer about Bilal, and he's been turned into this sort of very cheesy action hero figure person. The best way I can describe it is a bit like Bob the Builder meets Rambo meets The Message. I don't know if you watched The Message, but the Hadith also speak of the importance of treating your slaves well and even providing your slave girl with an education. But just like in the Quran, in later Hadiths from the time of Medina, you find many references to slavery, especially female captives of war.
Many Muslim apologists often mention prisoners of war as an area where Muslims set new boundaries on what was moral. But the Hadith and the Seerah, particularly the early ones such as Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, which we happen to have here, paint a picture where treatment of captives was sometimes rather dehumanizing. What are you doing?
Is this Ibn Hisham?
Yeah,
it
smells
like,
quite old.
It smells like old book. It's like the old
I love
book.
that smell. The women of Banu Qurayza, for example, were captured as slaves after the Battle of the Trench and exchanged for horses and weapons.
Now it's important to note that these prisoners were not war combatants. They weren't actually fighting. They were part of the war booty, or what's called hummus. In fact, I always think, if you capture a tribe that can make hummus, are you capturing hummus? Several hadith recall incidences where men ask Muhammad whether they can have sex with the female prisoners, and some even go into the specifics, such as whether they are allowed to pull out as a way of contraception.
Safiya bint Huyay, one of the wives of the Prophet, was actually amongst the captures from Banu Nazir after the Battle of Khaybar. Her father and husband were killed by the Muslims and she came in the share of one of the companions, but the Prophet asked for her to be kept aside for himself, and her mahr or dowry was actually her own manumission. What a lot of the hadith basically show is that slaves were human property that could be bought and sold, used to pay off debt, and carried out various physical tasks, including building the Prophet's own mimbar. Even someone like Abu Bakr, known for his kindness, is seen sometimes being a little bit harsh with his slaves, such as at one instance when the slave lost a camel.
There's a lot written about freeing slaves, and it's important not to ignore that. Muhammad advises that if you can't afford to fully free a slave, They can be made to work without hardship until they can buy their freedom from you. This is one of the positive things that Islam encourages, as it promoted the idea that a slave and a master should sit down and write down the terms of their freedom.
This is eerily similar to the rights slaves had in negotiating contracts during the Sumerian times around 3000 BC, but more on that in our next video.
The freeing of a Muslim slave in particular was seen as a good deed in Islam that could guarantee the master who freed the slave paradise. And for some weird reason, freeing slaves during the solar eclipses was recommended as well, I don't know why. But the same way that Hadith warned masters from treating their slaves harshly, others warned slaves from disobeying their masters, saying that the Muslim slaves who obey their owners will get double the reward. There's actually already also a hadith that says if a Muslim slave runs away from their master, their prayers would not be accepted. What all of this tells us is that slavery was not just accepted, but was alive and well throughout Muslim society in Medina, all the way to the end of Muhammad's life when the message of Islam was finalized.
So what about Sharia?
Slavery was a status recognized by Islamic law, stating that freeborn Muslims could not be enslaved, which meant that slaves were mostly non-Muslims, mostly captured in war. Reading through Islamic fiqh books, there doesn't seem to be much of a conversation about whether slavery is right or wrong.
The issues that were addressed at the time were usually very specific questions, like if you have two female slaves who are sisters, can you take both of them as ma malakat aymanuk? And whether the wealth of a slave who used to be wealthy will still belong to them after they're freed. So very specific details here.
One of the main focus areas of Sharia is around the logistics of capturing slaves and the laws regarding sexual relations with the slaves. According to Sharia, executing prisoners of war is strictly forbidden, but when a child or woman is taken captive, they become slaves by the mere fact of their capture. A married woman who was captured, their marriage was annulled.
Also, converting to Islam does not automatically earn a slave their freedom, although generally, like we mentioned before, freeing a believing slave is said to increase the master's heavenly reward.
So we can say that by regulating the practice of slavery through Sharia, Islam accepts it and institutionalizes the foundations of slavery within Islamic law. But slavery wasn't immediately banned in Islam because it was absolutely everywhere, and it was such a core economic institution. It would have created chaos just to end slavery and just to ban it like that. It would have created an underclass of slaves, as we saw in America after the transatlantic slave.
First of all, slavery wasn't quite everywhere, but it's also not true that you needed slaves to create economic output. There are examples of civilizations that had limited slaves, and some cases where slave trading seems to have been banned altogether. Secondly, Islam banned alcohol within under a year. The streets of Medina were flowing with wine from the Muslims throwing it away.
Finally, we're talking about an omnipotent God here. So, as the final message to humanity from God, Islam could have easily laid down explicitly abolitionist rules which would have stood the test of time and remained relevant as humanity progressed. Instead, not only were slaves around during the time of Muhammad, owned by Muslims, but also after Muhammad's death during every single khilafah, including just under 100 years ago.
In the next video, we'll talk a little bit more about the historical context and the situation of slaves in Islamic history from the time of the Rashidun leading up to the different Islamic dynasties and the modern day. So we're doing this because we absolutely love it. We're really nerds about this area, and it's almost embarrassing how much time we've spent on this video.
So we've set up a Patreon account. With certain rewards, there's the ability to actually promote a question that we can then do a video on. Until next time, Hurayra is saying bye. Say bye, Hurayra. Bye. So my question to you, Nourhan, is...
Yahya al-Kali.
Yahya al-Kali?
Oh,
I want recording audio all this time.
what?